Hello and welcome to Dreamtime History. Picture yourself standing beside a quiet Venetian canal in the depths of night. The water laps gently against ancient stone, reflecting the amber glow of street lamps. But beneath your feet, something extraordinary lies hidden in the darkness. Streets that once knew the footsteps of Roman merchants, dock pilings driven deep into lagoon mud 15 centuries ago. An entire lost world, quietly submerged beneath Venice's shimmering waterways. This is the story of Venice's hidden underworld, not the romantic gondola rides and glittering palazzos of postcards, but the secret city that archaeology has only recently begun to reveal. The Romans were here first, building roads and harbours where tourists now glide in water taxis. But how did an empire's infrastructure end up beneath the waves? What can these submerged streets tell us about the rise and transformation of one of history's most impossible cities? And what other secrets lie sleeping in the mud beneath the canals? But before we descend into the depths, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a wonderfully simple way to support the channel, and it truly means the world to me. You find yourself standing on a narrow stone bridge in Venice, long after the last tourists have retreated to their hotels and the city has settled into its ancient rhythm. The night air carries the scent of salt and seaweed, mingling with the faint aroma of old stone that has absorbed centuries of maritime moisture. Below you, the canal stretches away into darkness, its surface broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the weathered steps of a palazzo whose foundations disappear into the black depths. Listen carefully, and you will hear something more than the soft slap of waves against stone. There is a deeper sound, almost imperceptible, like a whispered conversation between past and present. The water speaks in tongues older than the ornate facades that line these waterways, older than the gondolas that will tomorrow carry their cargo of camera-wielding visitors through these liquid streets. Beneath the surface, something waits in patient silence. You lean against the bridge's marble balustrade and feel the subtle vibration of water moving through the city's veins. Venice appears to float before you like a dream made manifest in stone and timber, but this impression of weightless beauty conceals a more profound truth. This city does not simply rest upon the water. It has grown from it, been shaped by it, and in some places, been reclaimed by it. The boundary between land and sea here has always been negotiable, a contract written in sediment and tide that each generation has renegotiated according to their needs and nature's demands. As your eyes adjust to the darkness, you begin to notice details that daylight and crowds obscure. The way certain buildings seem to sink slightly into the canal, as if the earth beneath them were slowly, inexorably giving way. The green water stains that mark the stones at a level higher than tonight's tide, testament to floods that have lapped hungrily at doorsteps and invaded ground floors. The wooden pilings, black with age and water, that emerge from the canal's edge like the ribs of some great beast slumbering just beneath the surface. But these are only the visible hints of a far more extraordinary story. In recent years, archaeologists working in the Venice lagoon have made discoveries that transform our understanding of this place. Using sophisticated underwater survey techniques, they have mapped the ghostly outline of structures that predate Venice itself by many centuries. Roman roads, built not on solid ground but on the shifting ridges of an ancient shoreline, now lie submerged beneath several feet of water and sediment. Dock systems, warehouses and workshops from the imperial age rest in the lagoon's mud, their careful stonework slowly dissolving back into the sea that once made them wealthy. You imagine yourself descending through the dark water, past the familiar foundations of medieval Venice, past the wooden piles driven deep into the lagoon floor by craftsmen whose names are lost to history. Deeper still, until you reach those Roman constructions, their masonry still bearing the marks of the tools that shaped them 15 centuries ago. Here, in this underwater museum, you would find the remnants of a different relationship between human ambition and the natural world. The Romans who built these submerged structures understood something that modern visitors rarely grasp. This lagoon was never empty water waiting to be filled with a city. It was a complex living system of channels and islands, marshes and sandbars, where the boundaries between land and sea shifted with each tide and each season. The Romans did not conquer this environment. They adapted to it, working with its rhythms rather than against them. They built their roads on the natural ridges that the sea had carved, positioned their docks where the currents would serve their purposes, and designed their settlements to breathe with the tides. What happened to that ancient understanding? How did those practical Roman engineers become the forgotten architects of a lost city? Standing here on this bridge, surrounded by the gentle sounds of water finding its level, you sense that the answer lies not in any single catastrophe, but in the slow accumulation of changes, both human and natural. Sea levels that rose gradually over centuries, land that settled and compacted under the weight of increasingly ambitious construction, channels that silted up as shipping patterns changed and maintenance systems failed. The city that tourists see today, with its impossible beauty balanced on wooden stilts, represents not the triumph of human engineering over nature, but a continuous negotiation between human desire and environmental reality. Every palazzo, every bridge, every narrow alleyway speaks of countless decisions made by builders who understood that they were not constructing on solid ground, but on a foundation that would always remain, in some essential way, temporary. As you prepare to leave this quiet bridge and return to the warmth of your hotel, you cast one last look into the dark water below. Somewhere beneath that deceptively calm surface lie the bones of the Roman city that gave birth to Venice, its streets and squares now home to fish and marine plants, its ambitious plans reduced to archaeological fragments. Yet this earlier city's legacy persists in ways both visible and hidden, shaping the contours of the modern city like the ghost of an older dream, still partially remembered in stone and timber. The water continues its ancient conversation, carrying secrets from the depths to those patient enough to listen. To understand the Venice that emerged from these waters, you must first journey backwards through time, beyond the marble palaces and Byzantine domes, beyond even the wooden foundations that tourists imagine as the city's beginning. You must travel to a time when this entire region existed in a state of perpetual negotiation between earth and sea, when the very concept of solid ground was a luxury that few locations could claim with confidence. Picture yourself standing not on a bridge or a piazza, but on a patch of marshy ground that might be an island at high tide and a peninsula when the waters recede. The year might be 500 before the Common Era, or perhaps 2 centuries later. Time moves differently in this watery realm, measured not in the rapid succession of human generations, but in the slow accumulation of sediment and the patient carving of channels by countless tides. The landscape around you defies the neat categories that land dwellers prefer. Here, a ridge of sand and shells rises just high enough above the waterline to support a few hardy shrubs, whose roots have learned to drink both fresh rainwater and the salt spray that arrives with each tide. There, a channel winds between patches of marsh grass, carrying the mingled waters of Alpine rivers and the Adriatic Sea in a slow dance that has been choreographed by wind and current over millennia. This is the northern Adriatic lagoon system, a vast network of shallow waters, shifting sandbars, and ephemeral islands that stretches along the coastline like a complex manuscript written in mud and brine. The very ground beneath your feet tells a story of constant change. What appears solid today may be underwater tomorrow, not through any sudden catastrophe, but through the ordinary magic of tidal flow and sediment transport that makes this place unlike anywhere else on Earth. You breathe the distinctive scent of this environment, the sharp tang of salt air mingled with the richer, earthier aroma of decaying vegetation, and the clean smell of fresh water flowing from distant mountains toward the sea. Gulls wheel overhead, their cries mixing with the gentler sounds of water lapping against reed beds and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface of a tidal pool. The people who first chose to make their homes in this challenging environment were the Veneti, a tribe whose very name would eventually be preserved in the word Venice, though their relationship to these waters was far more pragmatic than poetic. They understood something that later civilizations would struggle to learn, that survival in this landscape required not the conquest of nature, but collaboration with its rhythms. For the Veneti, the lagoon's apparent instability was actually a form of security. The constantly shifting channels and the maze of islands and marshes created a natural fortress that was nearly impossible for enemies to navigate without intimate local knowledge. Raiders might find solid ground one day, only to discover it transformed into an impassable marsh the next. The very qualities that made this region challenging for permanent settlement also made it an ideal refuge for those who understood its secrets. When Roman power expanded into this region, the imperial engineers encountered a landscape that challenged their traditional approaches to infrastructure and urban planning. Romans excelled at building straight roads and permanent structures, at imposing geometric order upon conquered territories. But here, in this realm of shifting boundaries, they were forced to become students of a more fluid kind of engineering. The Roman settlement of Altinum arose on slightly higher ground near the lagoon, serving as a crucial link in the transportation networks that connected the northern Italian plains with the broader Mediterranean world. But even this apparently conventional Roman town was shaped by its proximity to the lagoon's unique environment. Archaeological evidence suggests that Altinum's prosperity depended heavily on its ability to manage the complex relationship between fresh water, flowing from the mainland rivers, and salt water arriving from the sea. More remarkably, recent discoveries have revealed that Roman engineers constructed infrastructure directly within the lagoon itself, building roads and dock systems on the natural ridges that the sea had carved from sand and sediment. These submerged Roman constructions, now lying beneath several feet of water and centuries of accumulated mud, represent a sophisticated understanding of how to work with, rather than against, the lagoon's dynamic character. You imagine yourself as one of those Roman engineers, standing on a ridge of compressed sand and shells that rises just above the high tide mark, calculating how to build a road that will serve the empire's needs, while respecting the lagoon's tendency to reshape itself with each seasonal flood. The solution they developed was both practical and elegant. Instead of fighting the water, they learned to dance with it, creating structures that could flex and adapt while still serving their essential functions. The wooden pilings that these Roman builders drove deep into the lagoon floor were selected not just for their strength, but for their ability to survive in this waterlogged environment. Oak and larch, cut from the forests of the northern mountains, proved remarkably resistant to decay when permanently submerged, creating foundations that would endure long after the civilizations that installed them had faded into memory. This early period of adaptation and experimentation created the template for all future development in the region. The essential techniques of lagoon construction, from the selection of timber to the placement of stone foundations, from the management of tidal flow to the creation of artificial islands, all emerge from this ancient dialogue between human ingenuity and environmental constraint. As you stand in this primordial landscape, watching the tide slowly transform a walkable mudflat into a navigable waterway, you begin to understand that Venice did not spring forth fully formed like some maritime goddess rising from the waves. Instead, it grew slowly, organically, from centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to live and build in a place where the very ground shifts with the phases of the moon. Now you must descend deeper into the mysteries that lie beneath Venice's shimmering surface, into the realm where Roman ambition met the lagoon's ancient rhythms and created something unprecedented in the empire's vast catalogue of engineering achievements. Here, in the waterlogged foundations of what would one day become the world's most improbable city, lie the remnants of a civilization that learned to build not despite the water, but because of it. In the early decades of the 21st century, marine archaeologists working in the Venice lagoon made a discovery that would fundamentally alter our understanding of this region's history. Using sophisticated underwater survey equipment, they identified the unmistakable traces of a Roman road system lying several feet beneath the lagoon's muddy floor. This was not some accidental submersion of terrestrial infrastructure, but evidence of deliberate construction within the lagoon itself, a testament to Roman engineering adaptability that had been hidden beneath the waves for more than 15 centuries. You find yourself transported back to the height of Roman power, standing on what appears to be solid ground, but which you now recognize as one of the carefully constructed ridges that Roman engineers had identified as the lagoon's natural highways. The morning sun glints off the water that surrounds this narrow causeway, and you feel the slight give beneath your feet that tells you this road was built not on bedrock, but on the compressed sand and shell deposits that the sea had been accumulating for millennia. The engineering challenge that confronted these Roman builders was unlike anything their colleagues faced in other parts of the empire. In Gaul or Britain, roads could be carved through forests and laid across solid ground according to the empire's famously direct principles. But here, in this realm of shifting sediments and tidal flows, the Romans were forced to become students of a more fluid form of construction, one that required them to work with natural processes rather than against them. The road beneath your feet follows the contours of a Paleolithic beach ridge, a remnant of an ancient shoreline that had been slowly modified by centuries of wave action and sediment deposition. Roman surveyors had recognized that these ridges offered the most stable foundation available in this watery landscape, and they had learned to reinforce them with carefully placed stone and timber rather than attempting to impose their own geometric vision upon the lagoon's organic architecture. You can almost hear the sounds of Roman construction echoing across the water, the rhythmic hammering of workers driving oak pilings deep into the lagoon floor, the splash of stone blocks being lowered into position, the creaking of wooden cranes as they maneuvered massive building materials into place. These were not the sounds of conquest, but of adaptation, as Roman engineering prowess bent itself to the task of creating lasting infrastructure in an environment that seemed designed to resist permanence. The dock system that accompanied this submerged road network represents perhaps the most sophisticated example of Roman hydraulic engineering outside the empire's major ports. Archaeological evidence suggests that these installations were designed not merely to accommodate the loading and unloading of ships, but to manage the complex tidal flows that could make such operations treacherous for the uninitiated. The Romans had learned to read the lagoon's moods, to understand the subtle signs that indicated when conditions were favourable for maritime commerce and when it was wiser to wait for calmer waters. Picture yourself as a Roman merchant arriving at one of these lagoon docks with a cargo of amphorae filled with wine from the imperial vineyards, garum from the processing centres of Hispania, or perhaps exotic spices that had travelled the length of the Mediterranean before reaching these northern waters. The dockmaster who greets you has been trained not only in the mundane details of taxation and inventory, but in the more esoteric art of lagoon navigation. He knows which channels remain deep enough for your vessel's draught, which routes will carry you safely to your destination, and which areas to avoid when the tide is running strong. The wooden pilings that support these Roman installations were selected according to principles that would be rediscovered and refined by later generations of Venetian builders. Oak and larch, harvested from the forests of the Northern Alps, possessed the crucial quality of becoming harder and more durable when permanently submerged in salt water. These timbers, driven deep into the lagoon floor and cut off just below the low tide mark, would provide foundations that could support substantial masonry structures while remaining immune to the rot that would quickly destroy wood exposed to the alternating wet and dry conditions of the tidal zone. The workshops and warehouses that clustered around these Roman docks served functions that went far beyond simple storage and distribution. Archaeological remains suggest that these facilities were designed to take advantage of the lagoon's unique position at the intersection of Alpine trade routes and Mediterranean shipping lanes. Raw materials from the continental interior could be processed here using techniques learned from across the empire, then shipped to markets that stretched from the Black Sea to the Atlantic coast of Africa. You walk carefully along the Roman causeway, feeling the slight movement of the structure as it responds to the pressure of passing waves. This is engineering of a different kind from the mighty aqueducts and amphitheatres for which Rome is remembered, but it represents an equally sophisticated understanding of how to work with natural forces rather than against them. The Romans who built these submerged installations had learned something that would prove crucial for all future development in this region, that success in the lagoon required not the imposition of rigid geometric order, but a more flexible approach that could adapt to the environment's inherent fluidity. The legacy of these Roman foundations extends far beyond their immediate practical functions. The techniques they developed for building on unstable ground, for managing tidal flows, and for creating structures that could flex with environmental pressures would provide the template for everything that followed in this remarkable location. When later builders sought to expand and elaborate upon these foundations, they would draw upon engineering principles that had been proven in practice over centuries of use. As you prepare to leave this ancient construction site and return to your own time, you pause to consider the profound transformation that has occurred here. What began as Roman pragmatism, as the simple need to create workable infrastructure in a challenging environment, has become the foundation for one of history's most extraordinary cities. As the centuries passed and the Roman Empire began its slow transformation from unified colossus to fragmented successor states, the carefully maintained infrastructure of the lagoon settlements faced new challenges that had little to do with engineering and everything to do with the changing nature of human civilization itself. You find yourself witnessing the twilight of one world and the tentative dawn of another, standing in the ruins of Altinum as its remaining inhabitants make the momentous decision to abandon the solid ground their ancestors had trusted for generations. Altinum had been the Roman lagoon's most successful compromise between imperial ambition and environmental reality. Built on slightly elevated ground near the lagoon's northeastern edge, it had served as the crucial link between the maritime networks of the Adriatic and the terrestrial trade routes that connected northern Italy to the Alpine passes and the lands beyond. For centuries, its warehouses had stored goods flowing between distant provinces, its workshops had processed raw materials from across the known world, and its citizens had prospered from their position at the intersection of water and land. But by the 5th and 6th centuries, the world that had sustained Altinum's prosperity was disintegrating. The imperial administration that had maintained the roads and protected the trade routes was fragmenting under pressures both external and internal. Barbarian peoples, driven by their own complex migrations and conflicts, were establishing new kingdoms in the territories that had once acknowledged Roman authority. More immediately threatening to the inhabitants of Altinum, these same peoples were launching increasingly bold raids into the prosperous settlements of the northern Italian plains. You stand in what remains of Altinum's forum, feeling the weight of abandonment that settles over places when their purpose has been outlived by history. The marble columns that once supported the porticos where merchants negotiated deals and civic officials conducted the business of empire now provide perches for seabirds, whose cries echo across empty spaces. Weeds grow between the carefully fitted stones of pavements that once rang with the footsteps of citizens hurrying about their daily business. The decision facing Altinum's inhabitants was not merely practical but existential. This solid ground beneath their feet, which had seemed to represent permanence and security in an uncertain world, had become a liability in an age when mobility and defensibility mattered more than monumental architecture. The barbarian raiders who swept down from the northern passes could move swiftly across the plains, but they had no expertise in navigating the treacherous channels and shifting sandbanks of the lagoon itself. And so began one of history's most remarkable migrations, not across vast distances, but across the fundamental boundary between land and water. You can almost see them, these last Romans of Altinum, loading their most precious possessions onto shallow draft boats, and setting out across waters that their ancestors had viewed as highways for commerce, but which would now become highways to refuge. The islands they chose for their new settlements were selected according to criteria that would have seemed counterintuitive to earlier generations of builders. Instead of seeking the highest, most stable ground, these refugees deliberately chose locations that were difficult to access, surrounded by channels too shallow for large vessels, but deep enough for the flat-bottomed boats that served as the lagoon. Dwellers' primary means of transportation. Defensibility trumped convenience. Adaptability became more valuable than permanence. These early medieval settlers brought with them not only their personal belongings, but also their accumulated knowledge of Roman construction techniques, though they would soon discover that building in their new environment required significant modifications to traditional methods. The stone foundations that had served so well on the solid ground of Altinum could not simply be transplanted to islands that might shift with seasonal flooding or settle under their own weight into the soft sediments of the lagoon floor. Instead, these Proto-Venetians became innovators by necessity, developing new approaches to construction that drew upon both Roman engineering principles and the harsh lessons of their waterlogged environment. They learned to drive wooden pilings deeper than their predecessors had imagined necessary, creating foundations that reached down through layers of soft mud to more stable substrates below. They discovered which types of timber would survive permanent submersion and which would quickly rot in the alternating wet and dry conditions of the tidal zone. Most importantly, they began to develop a new relationship with the materials of construction itself. The quarried stone that had been the foundation of Roman monumentality was difficult to transport to their island refuges and unsuitable for the flexible foundations their environment required. Instead, these early settlers became expert recyclers, salvaging building materials from the abandoned structures of the mainland and adapting them to serve new purposes in their amphibious settlements. You walk carefully across one of these early settlements, feeling the slight movement of structures that had been designed not to resist the motion of their unstable foundations, but to move with them. The houses around you are modest in scale, built close to the waterline not from choice but from necessity. Every family owns boats as naturally as mainland dwellers owned horses, and the narrow channels between buildings serve as streets down which neighbours visit each other by rowing rather than walking. This is not yet Venice as history would remember it, but something both more fragile and more resilient, a community that had learned to thrive in an environment that demanded constant adaptation. The residents of these early lagoon settlements could not build monumental structures that would last for millennia, but they had created something perhaps more valuable, a way of life that could bend without breaking, that could respond to changing conditions without losing its essential character. The transformation from Roman solidity to medieval fluidity was neither sudden nor complete. For generations, these lagoon dwellers maintained connections to the mainland, continuing to participate in whatever remained of the old commercial networks while developing new forms of economic activity based on their unique position between land and sea. They became specialists in salt production, masters of fishing and navigation, and eventually the inheritors of a maritime tradition that would carry them far beyond the confines of their original lagoon refuge. The centuries that followed the Great Migration from the mainland witnessed a transformation so profound that it would have been unrecognizable to those early refugees who had fled to the lagoon islands seeking only security from barbarian raids. What began as a collection of precarious settlements scattered across the waterways gradually evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a maritime republic that would dominate Mediterranean commerce for nearly a millennium while remaining forever anchored to its watery foundations. You find yourself drifting in a gondola through the heart of medieval Venice, at the peak of its power, perhaps in the 13th or 14th century, when the city had achieved that perfect balance between audacious ambition and environmental accommodation that would define its golden age. The narrow canal before you pulses with activity as boatmen navigate their craft, between the palazzi that rise directly from the water, like dreams made manifest in stone and timber. The air carries the mingled sense of the sea and human enterprise, salt and seaweed mixing with the rich aromas of exotic spices, the sharp tang of metalwork, and the earthy smell of wet wood that forms the invisible foundation of everything you see. This is Venice at its most impossible and most triumphant, a city that had learned not merely to survive in its aquatic environment, but to transform that environment into the source of its strength. The governance system that emerged from these unique circumstances reflected the practical wisdom that centuries of lagoon living had instilled in its inhabitants. The Doge who ruled from the magnificent palace that dominated the city's ceremonial heart was not an autocrat in the traditional sense, but rather the elected representative of a merchant aristocracy that had learned to balance individual ambition with collective necessity. The political structure that evolved in Venice bore little resemblance to the monarchies and feudal hierarchies that characterized most of medieval Europe. Instead, the Venetians developed a complex system of councils and committees, checks and balances, that ensured power remained distributed among the great merchant families while preventing any single individual or faction from gaining dominance. This was democracy of a sort, though limited to those families whose wealth and commercial networks had established their place in the city's elaborate social hierarchy. The 6 districts known as sestieri that divided the city reflected not arbitrary administrative convenience, but the organic growth patterns that had emerged from the lagoon's natural geography. Each sestiere developed its own character and specializations, from the governmental heart of San Marco to the industrial workshops of Castello, from the financial centre of Rialto to the shipbuilding arsenals that produced the galleys, upon which Venice's maritime empire depended. You walk carefully along one of the narrow pathways that wind between buildings, feeling the slight vibration underfoot that reminds you that this entire city rests upon wooden pilings driven deep into the lagoon floor. The architectural marvels that surround you represent a continuous dialogue between human aspiration and environmental constraint. Every palace, every church, every humble workshop had been designed according to principles that took into account not only aesthetic considerations, but also the practical requirements of building upon ground that was never entirely solid. The Fondaco system that organized much of Venice's international commerce reflected the same practical wisdom that informed the city's political and architectural development. These combination warehouses, trading posts, and diplomatic compounds housed foreign merchants according to their nations of origin, creating distinct communities within the larger city, while ensuring that commercial activities remained under Venetian supervision and taxation. The German merchants of the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, the Byzantine traders of their own establishments, and the Islamic merchants who were permitted their carefully regulated commercial activities all contributed to the cosmopolitan atmosphere that made Venice unique among medieval cities. The daily rhythms of Venetian life were synchronized not to the ringing of bells that marked the canonical hours in other cities, but to the eternal pulse of the tides that governed all movement through the city's liquid streets. Gondoliers developed an almost mystical understanding of current and tide, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated when passages would be navigable and when it was wiser to wait for more favourable conditions. Dock workers timed their activities to take advantage of high water that would allow the largest vessels to reach the commercial heart of the city, while artisans in waterside workshops planned their schedules around the tidal cycles that affected everything from the delivery of raw materials to the disposal of waste products. The technological innovations that emerged from Venice's unique environment extended far beyond the famous glass-making workshops of Murano, though these certainly represented one of the most spectacular examples of how the city's isolation and specialized knowledge could create competitive advantages in international markets. The shipyards of the arsenal developed construction techniques that allowed them to produce vessels of unprecedented size and sophistication, while the city's hydraulic engineers created flood management systems that could protect low-lying areas during the seasonal high waters that threatened to inundate the more vulnerable districts. Children who grew up in this environment developed an intuitive understanding of water and its ways that would have been impossible to acquire in any terrestrial city. They learned to swim almost before they could walk, to handle small boats with the casual expertise that other children might display with horses or farm animals, and to navigate the complex network of channels and bridges that connected their neighbourhoods to the wider world of the lagoon. The sounds of this medieval Venice would have been unlike those of any other city. The splash of oars and the gentle lapping of water against stone replacing the clatter of cartwheels, and the thunder of hoofbeats that characterised life in landlocked settlements. The calls of boatmen announcing their approach at blind corners, the creaking of timber foundations flexing with the tide, and the distant sounds of shipbuilding and metalwork created an urban symphony that was entirely aquatic in its fundamental character, yet entirely sophisticated in its commercial and cultural complexity. But beneath the splendour of Venice's golden age, beneath the marble facades and the busy commerce of its canals, a different kind of history was quietly accumulating in the darkness below the waterline. You descend now into the hidden Venice, the city that exists in perpetual twilight beneath the foundations of the world that tourists and merchants see, a realm where time moves differently and where the careful distinctions between past and present dissolve in the brackish water that seeps through ancient masonry. In the cellar of a 13th century palazzo near the Rialto, you find yourself standing ankle-deep in water that rises and falls with the rhythm of the tides. The electric lighting that illuminates this subterranean space reveals walls that tell a complex story of construction, abandonment, and adaptation spanning more than a millennium. What appears to be the basement of a medieval merchant's house is revealed, upon closer examination, to be built directly upon the remains of much older structures, whose purpose and origins stretch back into the shadowy centuries when this location was part of the Roman lagoon settlement network. The phenomenon you're witnessing here is being repeated throughout Venice, with increasing frequency as the city continues its inexorable subsidence into the lagoon that gave it birth. At a rate of approximately 1 to 2 millimeters per year, Venice is sinking back into the waters that once seemed to offer it perfect protection from the uncertainties of terrestrial politics. This gradual descent, combined with the rising sea levels that represent one of the most tangible consequences of our planet's changing climate, is slowly revealing archaeological treasures that have been hidden for centuries beneath layers of more recent construction. You run your hand along a wall where medieval brickwork gives way to older masonry techniques, and you realize that you are touching stones that were placed by Roman craftsmen working according to engineering principles, developed in an entirely different political and technological era. The wooden pilings that support the medieval structure above your head are themselves driven through layers of earlier construction, creating a complex stratigraphy of human habitation that extends downward through centuries of accumulated history. This is the real secret of Venice's construction, far more complex and gradual than the romantic legends that speak of a city rising fully formed from the waves, like some aquatic Athena springing from the head of Zeus. The Venice that dominates the historical imagination was built not on virgin lagoon floor, but upon the accumulated foundations of earlier settlements, each generation adapting and reusing the materials and techniques of their predecessors, while adding their own innovations to meet the changing demands of their environment. The myth-busting satisfaction of understanding this layered reality extends beyond simple historical curiosity into a deeper appreciation of how human societies actually develop in challenging environments. The popular image of Venice as a city built on wooden pilings driven directly into the lagoon floor contains enough truth to be convincing, but it obscures the far more interesting story of how those pilings were often driven through the remains of earlier construction projects, how medieval builders routinely incorporated Roman stones and timber into their new structures, and how each generation's innovations built quite literally upon the foundations laid by their predecessors. Archaeological investigation of these flooded basements has revealed evidence of continuous occupation and construction that stretches back to the earliest days of Roman lagoon settlement. In some locations, modern buildings rest upon medieval foundations, which in turn were constructed using Roman-era pilings and masonry. The result is a kind of architectural palimpsest, where each era has written its story over the partially erased text of earlier periods, creating a document of extraordinary complexity and historical depth. The rising water that now threatens these basement levels also serves as an inadvertent preservative, maintaining the wooden elements of these ancient foundations in a state of anaerobic suspension that prevents the decay that would quickly destroy them if they were exposed to air. You examine a Roman-era piling that emerges from the flooded floor of this medieval basement, its surface blackened by centuries of submersion, but still solid enough to support the weight of the structures above. The wood appears almost petrified, transformed by its long immersion into something harder and more durable than it was when first cut from the alpine forests that supplied Venice's builders. The techniques developed by these successive generations of lagoon builders represent a continuous dialogue between human ingenuity and environmental constraint that extends across more than 15 centuries of experimentation and adaptation. Each solution created new problems that required further innovation. Each innovation opened new possibilities that previous generations could not have imagined, and each generation inherited both the benefits and the challenges created by their predecessors' choices. You wade carefully through the rising water, feeling the gentle movement of the tide as it finds its way through cracks and joints in masonry that was never intended to be completely waterproof. The electrical systems that serve this basement have been raised above the highest flood levels, but the water continues its patient work of dissolution, slowly returning to the lagoon the materials that were borrowed from it centuries ago. This process of gradual submersion is not simply decay or destruction, but a form of transformation that returns these structures to the aquatic environment from which they emerged. The stones and timber that Roman engineers so carefully positioned to work with the lagoon's tidal rhythms are once again feeling the daily pulse of water that connects them to the broader ecosystem of which they have always been a part. As you prepare to ascend from this flooded underworld back to the daylight levels of the contemporary city, you carry with you a deeper appreciation of the complexity that underlies Venice's apparent impossibility. The city's survival for more than a millennium in this challenging environment represents not a single moment of brilliant engineering, but a continuous process of adaptation and innovation that has created one of the most sophisticated examples of sustainable architecture in human history. The prosperity that transformed Venice from a collection of refugee settlements into the dominant maritime power of the medieval Mediterranean came at a price that few of its citizens fully understood, until that price began to demand payment in ways that could no longer be ignored or deferred. You stand now at the height of Venetian commercial success, perhaps in the 14th century, watching as the very achievements that had made the city wealthy and powerful began to create pressures that would ultimately test the delicate balance between human ambition and environmental sustainability that had sustained lagoon civilization for so many centuries. The wealth flowing through Venice's channels during this golden age was staggering in both quantity and diversity. Galleys returning from the Levant carried holds filled with precious spices, silks, and exotic goods that commanded premium prices in the markets of northern Europe. The salt works that dotted the lagoon's periphery produced the white gold that preserved food and created fortunes throughout the Mediterranean world. Venetian glass, blown in the workshops of Murano according to closely guarded secrets, found its way into the treasuries of princes and the collections of wealthy merchants across the known world. But this commercial empire, built upon the movement of goods across vast distances of water, created demands upon Venice's infrastructure that tested the ingenuity of its engineers and the limits of its environmental accommodation. The great galleys that brought prosperity to the city also brought unprecedented challenges to the narrow channels and fragile foundations that supported lagoon civilization. Each heavily laden ship that navigated the city's waterways created wakes that accelerated the erosion of canal banks, while the increasing size and weight of commercial vessels required deeper channels and stronger moorings than the lagoon's natural configuration could easily provide. You watch from a waterside palazzo as a massive galley, its holds bulging with cargo from Constantinople, manoeuvres carefully through the canal below your window. The vessel's wake sets moored boats rocking and sends waves lapping higher than usual against the building's foundations. This scene, repeated hundreds of times each year as Venice's commercial networks expanded, represents both the source of the city's wealth and the beginning of its environmental challenges. The very success of Venetian trade networks created a feedback loop that would prove increasingly difficult to manage. As commerce expanded, the city grew wealthier and more ambitious in its construction projects. Palazzi rose higher and more elaborate along the canals, their marble facades and ornate decorations representing not just aesthetic achievement, but also enormous increases in the weight that the lagoon floor was expected to support. The timber pilings that had adequately supported the modest structures of earlier generations now groaned under loads that their designers had never imagined. The engineering challenges created by this prosperity required solutions that often created new problems in turn. Channels had to be dredged deeper to accommodate larger ships, but dredging destabilized the banks and required expensive reinforcement with stone and timber. Embankments had to be built higher and stronger to protect valuable commercial districts from flooding, but these flood defences altered the natural flow patterns of the lagoon and created unexpected erosion problems in other areas. The salt trade that provided one of Venice's most reliable sources of income also created environmental pressures that accumulated slowly over generations. The shallow ponds where seawater was evaporated to produce salt crystals required careful management of water flow and sediment deposition. As production expanded to meet growing demand, larger areas of the lagoon were converted to artificial salt works, altering the natural ecosystem and reducing the marshy areas that had traditionally served as natural flood buffers during periods of unusually high water. Meanwhile, the timber trade that supplied both Venice's own construction needs and the shipbuilding industry created its own environmental consequences. The forests of the Northern Alps and the Balkans were systematically harvested to provide the oak and larch pilings that supported every building in the city, as well as the masts, planking and structural timbers required by Venice's naval and commercial fleets. This deforestation in the watersheds that fed the lagoon altered patterns of rainfall absorption and river flow, contributing to increased sedimentation in the lagoon itself. You walk through the arsenal, Venice's great shipyard, where the sounds of hammering and sawing create a constant percussion that echoes across the water. Here, in these covered workshops, craftsmen are constructing the vessels that will carry Venetian merchants to markets stretching from London to Crimea, from Tunis to Trebizond. The scale of this operation is breathtaking, but so too is its appetite for resources. Each galley requires thousands of carefully selected timbers, miles of rope, acres of canvas, and tons of iron for anchors, weapons, and fittings. The metaphor that perhaps best captures Venice's situation during this period is that of a magnificent palace built upon sand. The city's wealth and power were real and impressive, but they rested upon foundations that were inherently unstable and becoming increasingly so as the scale of human activity in the lagoon expanded beyond the limits that the natural environment could easily accommodate. The environmental management systems that had served earlier generations of Venetians adequately were proving insufficient for the demands created by imperial success. The traditional methods of maintaining channels and managing floodwaters had been developed for a smaller, less wealthy city, with more modest ships and buildings. As Venice grew into a major European power, its infrastructure needs began to outpace the carrying capacity of its unique but fragile environment. Yet even as these pressures accumulated, few Venetians of the time would have recognized them as fundamental threats to their city's future. The problem seemed manageable through the same combination of engineering skill and commercial wealth that had built their maritime empire. Each challenge appeared to have a technical solution. Each environmental pressure could seemingly be addressed through more sophisticated construction techniques or more ambitious hydraulic projects. The irony that would become apparent only in hindsight was that the very qualities that had made Venice successful were beginning to undermine the environmental foundations of that success. By the late medieval period, the lagoon that had nurtured Venice through its rise to maritime dominance began to exhibit subtle but persistent signs that the delicate equilibrium between human activity and natural process was shifting in ways that would prove increasingly difficult to reverse. You stand at the edge of a canal in the 15th century, perhaps during one of those unremarkable autumn days when the water seems slightly higher than it should be, lapping at the steps of buildings in a way that suggests something fundamental has changed in the relationship between the city and the sea that sustains it. The warning signs manifested themselves not as dramatic catastrophes that would have commanded immediate attention, but as gradual alterations in patterns that had remained stable for generations. Flooding events that had once been rare, seasonal occurrences began to happen with disturbing frequency, transforming from exceptional disruptions requiring emergency response into regular inconveniences that demanded permanent adaptation. The stone steps that led down to canal-side docks, worn smooth by centuries of use, now disappeared beneath the waterline during high tides that previous generations would have considered unusual. Scientific measurement techniques that would not be developed for several more centuries eventually revealed the numerical precision of what 15th century Venetians could observe only through the accumulated experience of daily life. The relative sea level around Venice was rising at a rate of approximately 2.5 millimeters per year, a figure that represented the combination of actual sea level increases and the gradual subsidence of the land beneath the city itself. Venice was sinking back into the lagoon at a rate of approximately 1 to 2 millimeters annually, a process so gradual that individual lifespans could not encompass its full significance, yet so persistent that its effects accumulated across generations into transformational change. The subsidence that was slowly lowering Venice relative to sea level resulted from several interconnected processes, each invisible to casual observation, yet collectively powerful enough to alter the fundamental relationship between the city and its aquatic environment. The wooden pilings that supported every structure in the city were gradually compacting under the enormous weight of increasingly elaborate buildings, settling deeper into the soft sediments of the lagoon floor. The extraction of groundwater from wells that served the city's growing population was causing the underlying clay deposits to compress, creating microscopic decreases in elevation that added up to measurable subsidence over decades and centuries. More subtly, but perhaps more significantly, the lagoon's natural systems for managing sediment and maintaining the delicate balance between fresh water and salt water were beginning to show signs of stress that would prove difficult to address through traditional engineering approaches. The channels that connected the lagoon to the open sea were gradually silting up as upstream deforestation altered the patterns of erosion and sediment transport in the rivers that fed the lagoon system. Without adequate maintenance, these channels became shallower and more prone to blockage, reducing the lagoon's ability to flush itself clean with each tidal cycle. The salt marshes that had traditionally served as natural buffers during periods of unusually high water were disappearing as rising sea levels and human activity transformed them into deeper water or converted them to other uses. These marshes had played a crucial role in the lagoon's ecosystem, absorbing excess water during storms and seasonal floods, while providing habitat for the fish and birds that supported both the local economy and the broader environmental balance that made human habitation possible. You watch from a palazzo window as workers attempt to reinforce a canal bank that has been repeatedly undermined by the wakes of passing vessels and the persistent lapping of water at levels higher than the original builders had anticipated. The stone and timber they are installing represents a substantial investment, yet you sense that this is only the beginning of an increasingly expensive struggle to maintain infrastructure that was designed for environmental conditions that no longer exist. The hydraulic management systems that had been developed and maintained by earlier generations of Venetians were proving inadequate for the new challenges created by rising water levels and increased flooding frequency. The traditional methods of directing water flow through the lagoon, of maintaining channels and managing sediment deposition, had been designed for a more stable relationship between land and sea. As that relationship changed, these systems required constant modification and ever more sophisticated engineering interventions. The ironies inherent in Venice's situation were becoming apparent to those with the knowledge and perspective to recognize them. The city's success had created the wealth necessary to fund increasingly ambitious construction projects, but those same projects were adding weight to foundations that were already struggling with subsidence. The maritime trade that had made Venice wealthy required deeper channels and larger harbours, but the dredging necessary to accommodate bigger ships was destabilizing the very environment that had made the city's unique commercial advantages possible. The feedback loops between human activity and environmental change were creating cascading effects that proved remarkably difficult to anticipate or control. Solutions that addressed one problem often created new challenges elsewhere in the complex system of channels, tides, and settlements that comprised the lagoon ecosystem. The more sophisticated Venice became in its engineering approaches, the more dependent it became on technological interventions that required constant maintenance and periodic reinvention as environmental conditions continued to evolve. As you contemplate the scene before you, watching the patient work of builders attempting to shore up infrastructure that was never designed for current conditions, you begin to understand that Venice was entering a new phase of its relationship with the lagoon environment. The period of relatively stable accommodation between human ambition and natural process was giving way to an era of continuous adaptation and increasingly expensive technological mediation. As the centuries accumulated and Venice's relationship with its aquatic environment grew increasingly complex, the romantic narratives that would eventually capture the imagination of later generations began to diverge significantly from the archaeological realities that modern investigation has revealed. You find yourself in the position of a detective, examining evidence that contradicts some of the most cherished myths about how this impossible city actually came to exist. Myths that have proven so compelling that they have obscured the far more interesting story of gradual adaptation and continuous innovation that represents Venice's true historical achievement. The popular image of Venice as a city that sprang fully formed from the lagoon, supported by millions of tree trunks driven directly into virgin mud, contains enough truth to be convincing, while obscuring the far more complex reality of how human settlements actually develop in challenging environments over extended periods of time. The wooden pilings that do indeed support every structure in Venice were not installed according to some grand unified plan, but represent the accumulated decisions of hundreds of generations of builders, each working with the materials and techniques available to them while adapting to the specific conditions they encountered. The discovery of Roman road and dock systems lying beneath several feet of water and sediment in the Venice lagoon provides concrete evidence of this more complex settlement history. These submerged structures, identified through sophisticated underwater archaeological surveys, demonstrate that the area was not empty water waiting to be filled with a medieval city, but rather a location that had been continuously modified by human activity for more than a millennium before the traditional founding of Venice. The Roman engineers who built these installations had already solved many of the fundamental problems of construction in an amphibious environment, and their solutions provided both materials and techniques that later builders would adapt to meet their own needs. You examine the evidence of this layered construction history in the basement of a palazzo, where medieval foundations clearly incorporate Roman-era stones and timber. The masonry techniques visible in these walls tell a story of continuous adaptation and reuse that extends across centuries of technological and political change. Each generation of builders inherited both the achievements and the challenges created by their predecessors, and each developed their own innovations while working within the constraints imposed by earlier construction decisions. The gradual transformation of Venice's relationship with sea level and tidal flow represents a process that unfolded over such extended time periods that individual generations would have had difficulty recognizing the full scope of the changes taking place around them. The subsidence that continues to lower Venice relative to sea level at a rate of approximately 1 to 2 millimeters per year is not the result of any single catastrophic event, but rather the cumulative effect of countless individual decisions about construction techniques, material selection, and urban planning that seemed reasonable at the time they were made. The increasing frequency of flooding events that characterizes Venice's later medieval and early modern periods reflects not simply rising sea levels, but the complex interaction between environmental change and human modification of the lagoon ecosystem. As channels were dredged deeper to accommodate larger ships, as marshlands were converted to other uses, and as the watershed areas that fed the lagoon were deforested for timber and agriculture, the natural systems that had traditionally buffered the city against extreme tidal events became less effective at performing their protective functions. The adaptive responses that Venetians developed to cope with these changing conditions reveal both the ingenuity of a population that had learned to live with uncertainty and the increasing costs of maintaining urban infrastructure in an environment that was becoming less stable over time. Building thresholds were raised to keep floodwater out of ground floors, floor levels were elevated to provide additional protection against seasonal inundation, and increasingly sophisticated barrier systems were developed to protect vulnerable areas during periods of exceptional high water. Yet even these engineering solutions created new challenges that required further innovation and investment. Raising building thresholds altered the visual proportions of canal-side architecture and created accessibility problems for residents and merchants. Elevating floor levels required structural modifications that were expensive and sometimes compromised the integrity of older buildings. Flood barriers that protected one area often redirected water pressure to other locations that were less well defended, creating a need for system-wide approaches to flood management that were beyond the technical and financial resources of medieval engineering. The myth-busting satisfaction that comes from understanding these complex realities extends beyond simple historical curiosity into a deeper appreciation of how human societies actually adapt to environmental challenges over extended periods. The Venice that tourists admire today is not the result of a single moment of brilliant engineering insight, but rather the accumulated product of countless decisions, innovations, compromises, and adaptations that represent more than 15 centuries of continuous negotiation between human ambition and environmental constraint. The archaeological evidence lying beneath Venice's foundations tells a story that is simultaneously more modest and more impressive than the romantic legends that have grown up around the city's origins. Rather than representing the triumph of human will over natural obstacles, Venice's survival demonstrates the possibility of creating sustainable relationships between human communities and challenging environments through patience, flexibility, and continuous innovation. The Roman road system that lies submerged beneath the lagoon represents not a failure to be overcome, but an earlier chapter in the same ongoing story of adaptation and accommodation that continues today. As you contemplate this layered history, examining the evidence of continuous change and adaptation that lies both above and below the waterline, you begin to understand that Venice's true achievement lies not in its defiance of natural forces, but in its demonstration that human communities can learn to work with environmental constraints in ways that create lasting beauty and functionality. The transformation of Venice from its medieval zenith into the complex hybrid of museum and living city that would characterize its later centuries represents not a simple narrative of decline, but rather a more nuanced story of adaptation, reinvention, and the bittersweet dignity that accompanies all profound historical change. You find yourself walking through a Venice that exists in a state of perpetual negotiation with its own past, where each solution to contemporary challenges creates new relationships with the accumulated layers of history that lie both above and below the slowly rising waterline. In the outlying reaches of the lagoon, islands that had once supported thriving communities began to experience the environmental pressures that would eventually force their abandonment. Amiana, which had flourished during the early medieval period as a centre of salt production and fishing, found itself losing the battle against rising water levels and shifting tidal patterns. You can almost see the last residents loading their possessions onto boats and casting final glances back at houses that had sheltered their families for generations, structures that would soon disappear beneath the advancing waters to become archaeological sites accessible only to marine investigators. The abandonment of these peripheral settlements represented more than simple population movement. It marked the beginning of a concentration of human activity in the areas that could most effectively be defended against environmental change. Venice proper became the recipient of not only displaced populations, but also the accumulated knowledge, skills, and cultural traditions of communities whose physical foundations could no longer be maintained. The city grew denser and more complex as it absorbed these human and cultural resources while simultaneously adapting its own infrastructure to cope with changing conditions. The adaptive strategies that emerged during this period of environmental pressure demonstrate both the ingenuity of a population that had learned to live with uncertainty and the melancholy reality that adaptation often requires the sacrifice of beloved traditions and familiar ways of life. You watch craftsmen raising the floor levels of ground-floor workshops, lifting the functional heart of their businesses above the reach of increasingly frequent flooding, while accepting that this elevation fundamentally alters the relationship between their work and the canals that had traditionally provided both transportation and inspiration. The process of raising thresholds and elevating entryways throughout the city created a new architectural vocabulary that spoke of accommodation rather than triumph. Doorways that had once opened gracefully onto canal-level platforms now required additional steps, bridges, and staging areas that changed both the visual character of the streetscape and the daily rhythms of residents who had to navigate these new vertical relationships. The elegant proportions that had characterized earlier Venetian architecture gave way to more pragmatic arrangements that prioritized function over aesthetic coherence. Within the buildings themselves, basements that had served as storage areas, workshops, and social spaces gradually filled with water as subsidence and rising sea levels made these lower levels uninhabitable. You descend into one of these flooded cellars and find yourself in a space that has become an inadvertent archive, where the rising water has preserved wooden beams, stone foundations, and fragments of material culture that tell the story of how people actually lived during the city's earlier centuries. These submerged rooms represent a form of archaeological stratification, created not by burial under earth, but by submersion under the advancing tide. The construction of increasingly sophisticated floodgate systems and water management infrastructure represented Venice's most ambitious attempt to maintain its traditional relationship with the lagoon environment through technological intervention. These barriers, raised during periods of exceptionally high water, created temporary islands of dryness within the broader pattern of tidal flow. Yet even these engineering achievements came at the cost of altering the natural circulation patterns that had traditionally maintained the lagoon's ecological health and had provided the foundation for the city's original prosperity. The social and economic adaptations that accompanied these physical changes created new forms of Venetian identity that were simultaneously continuous with earlier traditions and fundamentally different from them. The merchant families whose wealth had been built on maritime trade found themselves managing increasingly complex relationships with mainland European markets, while their traditional Eastern Mediterranean networks became less reliable due to political and economic changes beyond their control. The craftsmen whose skills had been shaped by the unique requirements of lagoon construction found new applications for their expertise in the ongoing work of environmental adaptation and infrastructure maintenance. Perhaps most poignantly, the intellectual and cultural traditions that had flourished during Venice's Golden Age underwent their own forms of transformation and preservation. The libraries and archives that had accumulated during centuries of commercial and political prominence became repositories not only of documentary history, but also of practical knowledge about lagoon management, construction techniques, and environmental adaptation. You browse through manuscripts that record not only the grand political decisions of doges and councils, but also the accumulated wisdom of generations of engineers, boat builders, and flood managers whose expertise had become essential to the city's survival. The Venice that emerged from these centuries of adaptation retained its fundamental character as a place where human ambition had learned to work with, rather than against, environmental constraint. But it had become something different from what its earlier inhabitants would have recognized. The physical city bore the marks of continuous modification and accommodation, while its social and economic structures reflected the practical wisdom that comes from extended experience with managing complex relationships between human communities and dynamic natural systems. As you walk through the quiet campos and along the peaceful canals of this transformed Venice, you sense the presence of all the earlier versions of the city that lie embedded within the current configuration of stone and timber, water and memory. The Roman road that lies beneath the lagoon, the medieval foundations that support contemporary buildings, and the countless individual adaptations that have accumulated over more than a millennium create a palimpsest of human settlement that continues to evolve while honouring the essential insights that have made survival possible in this remarkable location. In the depths beneath Venice's everyday life, where the modern city's foundations meet the accumulated sediments of more than 2 millennia of human habitation, the echoes of earlier civilizations continue to resonate through the dark water that now fills spaces once occupied by Roman merchants, medieval craftsmen, and countless generations of lagoon dwellers whose names have been lost to history. You descend once again into this submerged realm, this time with a deeper understanding of how the layers of time have been compressed and preserved by the very water that now threatens the city's contemporary existence. The Roman road system that lies buried beneath several feet of lagoon mud represents far more than simply another archaeological discovery waiting to be catalogued by scholars and museum curators. These submerged stones and timber foundations provide tangible evidence of the continuity that connects Venice's present challenges with solutions that were developed and tested more than 15 centuries ago. The engineers who laid these roads understood something about working with the lagoon environment that remains relevant to contemporary efforts to manage the complex relationship between human settlement and aquatic ecosystem. Standing in the flooded basement of a palazzo that was built centuries after the Roman installations were forgotten, you can feel beneath your feet the slight vibration that indicates the continuing subsidence of the city at its measured pace of approximately 1 to 2 millimeters per year. This gradual descent represents not the failure of human engineering, but rather the inevitable consequence of building a major urban centre on the soft sediments of a dynamic lagoon environment. Every palazzo, every church, every humble workshop continues to settle slowly into the mud that gave Venice its birth, creating new archaeological layers even as older ones are revealed by the changing relationship between land and water. The stratigraphy that archaeologists discover when they investigate Venice's foundations tells a story that encompasses the entire sweep of European civilization, from the Roman Empire through the medieval flowering of Mediterranean commerce to the modern challenges of environmental management in an era of climate change. In a single excavation, researchers might encounter artifacts from a dozen different centuries, each representing a moment when human beings made decisions about how to live and build in this challenging environment, each contributing to the accumulated knowledge that makes contemporary Venice possible. You examine a wooden piling that emerges from the waterlogged floor of this basement, its surface blackened by centuries of submersion, but still solid enough to bear the weight of the structure above. This timber was cut from alpine forests during an era when Venice's maritime empire stretched across the Mediterranean, when the city's merchants negotiated with princes and sultans in languages that few contemporary Venetians could understand. Yet the engineering principles that determined how this piling was selected, prepared, and installed remain relevant to builders working in the lagoon today. The water that surrounds you as you explore this submerged level of the city carries with it dissolved minerals and organic compounds that tell their own story of environmental change and human adaptation. Chemical analysis of this water reveals traces of the various industrial activities that have taken place in Venice over the centuries, from the glass-making furnaces of Murano to the dyeing workshops that processed textiles for markets across Europe. Each of these activities left its signature in the sediments and groundwater that now form part of the complex chemical environment in which the city's foundations must survive. The resilience that has allowed Venice to persist through more than 15 centuries of environmental and political change emerges not from any single brilliant innovation, but from the accumulated wisdom of countless individuals who learned to adapt their techniques and expectations to the realities of building on shifting ground. The city's survival represents not the triumph of human will over natural forces, but rather the successful development of construction and management practices that work with rather than against the fundamental character of the lagoon environment. As you move through this underwater landscape, feeling the gentle current that indicates the tide's eternal rhythm even in these confined spaces, you begin to understand that the boundaries between natural and artificial, between past and present, between success and failure, become meaningless in the face of processes that operate on geological timescales. The Roman road that lies beneath the lagoon floor, the medieval foundations that support contemporary buildings, and the modern flood barriers that protect the city from exceptional tides all represent different chapters in the same ongoing story of accommodation between human aspiration and environmental reality. The echoes that reverberate through these flooded chambers carry not only the sounds of contemporary Venice, but also the accumulated vibrations of all the human activity that has taken place in this location since the first refugees from the mainland chose to build their lives on islands that seem to offer security from terrestrial chaos. Each footstep on the pavement above, each boat passing through the canals, Each tide reaching its peak and beginning its retreat adds its voice to this chorus of accumulated time that gives Venice its unique character as a place where history remains literally present beneath the surface of daily life. The preservation of this submerged heritage depends upon the same water that threatens to overwhelm the city's contemporary functions, creating a paradox that perfectly captures the essential character of Venice's relationship with its environment. The lagoon that endangers the city also protects its deepest secrets, maintaining in perfect stasis the evidence of how human beings have learned to create lasting beauty in one of the world's most challenging environments. As we reach the end of our journey through the hidden depths of Venice's extraordinary history, the lessons that emerge from this remarkable story extend far beyond the specific circumstances of one improbable city built upon the shifting foundations of a northern Italian lagoon. The tale of Venice's hidden underworld, of Roman roads lying beneath medieval canals, of civilizations layered one upon another like pages in a waterlogged manuscript, speaks to universal questions about the relationship between human ambition and the natural forces that both nurture and constrain all human endeavour. The yet most profound lesson that Venice offers to contemporary contemplation lies in its demonstration that even the grandest expressions of human power and ingenuity remain subject to the patient, inexorable rhythms of environmental change. The Roman Empire that built roads and docks in the lagoon was one of history's most successful experiments in organising human society on a continental scale, yet its carefully engineered infrastructure now lies submerged beneath layers of sediment and centuries of rising water. The medieval Venetian Republic that dominated Mediterranean commerce for nearly a millennium created architectural marvels and political innovations that continue to inspire admiration, yet it too had to adapt continuously to the shifting relationship between its foundations and the sea that sustained it. This is not a story of failure, but rather a meditation on the essential impermanence that characterizes all human achievements when viewed against the backdrop of geological time and environmental process. The Roman road that archaeologists have discovered beneath the Venice lagoon was not poorly designed or inadequately constructed. It was simply built in a world where sea levels and sediment patterns were different from those that exist today. The medieval palazzi that now require increasingly sophisticated flood defences were not the products of environmental ignorance, but rather the expressions of a civilization that had learned to work with the conditions that prevailed during its era of construction. The complexity of the systems that sustain human settlements in challenging environments emerges clearly from Venice's layered history. Environmental forces, hydraulic engineering, social organisation, economic networks, and political structures all interact in ways that make simple cause and effect explanations inadequate for understanding how societies actually adapt to changing circumstances over extended periods. The lagoon ecosystem that made Venice possible operates according to principles that encompass everything from tidal astronomy to sediment chemistry, from fish migration patterns to the seasonal cycles of alpine snowmelt. Human success in this environment required not mastery of these natural systems, but rather the development of social and technological approaches that could remain flexible enough to accommodate their inherent variability. Perhaps the most important cautionary wisdom that emerges from Venice's experience concerns the distinction between managing natural forces and attempting to master them. The engineering solutions that proved most durable over centuries of use were those that worked with the lagoon's fundamental characteristics rather than against them. The wooden pilings that continue to support the city's foundations succeed precisely because they accommodate the movement and settling that are inevitable in this environment. The canal system that provides Venice's transportation network follows routes that were first carved by natural tidal flows rather than imposed according to abstract geometric principles. Yet Venice's story also demonstrates the remarkable capacity of human communities to adapt, innovate, and persist, even under circumstances that might seem to preclude long-term survival. The refugees from Altinum who fled to the lagoon islands during the collapse of Roman authority created not merely temporary shelters, but the foundation for a civilization that would endure for more than 15 centuries. Each generation inherited both the achievements and the challenges created by their predecessors, and each found ways to build upon that legacy while adapting to the changing conditions of their own time. The resilience that allowed Venice to survive and flourish emerges not from any single brilliant innovation or heroic decision, but from the accumulated wisdom of countless individuals who learned to pay attention to their environment and to remain flexible in their responses to its demands. The boat builders who understood which timber would resist decay in salt water, the masons who learned to construct foundations that could flex with subsidence, the merchants who developed trade networks that could adapt to changing political circumstances, and the governing councils that created institutions capable of managing complex collective decisions all contributed to a social and technological system that proved remarkably robust in the face of environmental uncertainty. As you reflect upon this long history of human adaptation to environmental challenge, you might consider what lessons it offers for our own era, when the relationship between human societies and natural systems faces pressures that operate on global rather than local scales. Venice's experience suggests that sustainability emerges not from the attempt to create permanent solutions to environmental challenges, but from the cultivation of social and technological systems that remain capable of continuous adaptation as circumstances change. The Roman road that lies beneath the lagoon, the flooded basements that preserve medieval foundations, and the slowly sinking city that continues to adapt to rising waters all bear witness to the same essential truth: that human civilization flourishes when it learns to work with rather than against the fundamental characteristics of the environments that sustain it. The legacy of Venice's hidden underworld lies not in any particular technique or innovation, but in its demonstration that beauty, prosperity, and cultural achievement can emerge from patient attention to the dialogue between human aspiration and natural constraint. And as you close your eyes and let these reflections settle into the quiet corners of your mind, you can almost hear the gentle lapping of water against ancient stone, feel the soft movement of foundations that have learned to dance with the tide, and sense the accumulated wisdom of centuries drifting downward through layers of time and memory toward the peaceful depths, where understanding comes not through urgency or effort, but through the simple act of allowing yourself to rest in the patient rhythms that connect all human stories to the deeper currents of the world that sustains them.